Hello, everyone. So we now go to the second part of our lecture on for our research methods. And in this part of the session, we're going to discuss bias and confounding. So what is bias now, in the context of health research? So bias is any systematic error in the design, conduct, or analysis of a study that results in a mistaken estimate of an exposure, its effect on the effect on the risk of disease. So there are many different kinds of biases that can be introduced at any phase of the study, whether it's in the design, in the conduct, or even during the last part, which is the analysis of the study. So I'll give you some examples later on. No? So it's something that is inherent in studies, but it's important to be able to identify them in the protocol stage because there are actually ways of overcoming bias. Because if you introduce bias, it can change your conclusion. It can either overestimate or underestimate the magnitude of your conclusion or the magnitude of the increased risk of the disease based on a factor. So I'll give you some examples. So in bias, there is lack of neutrality or prejudice, meaning your prejudice against a certain group in your sample, in your population. So for example, your sample, or later on, I'll give you an example. So it introduces a deviation from the actual truth, any factor or process to deviate the results or conclusions of a trial systematically away from the truth. And it can either lead to overestimation or overestimation of the effects of interventions, making them look better or worse than they actually are. So I'll give you an example. This is a slide that shows the different cardiovascular outcome trials on the use of SGLT2 among patients with diabetes mellitus. So the EMPA-REG trial looked at the use of empagliflozin, which enrolled over 7,000 patients, and all of them had an established cardiovascular disease, meaning almost all of the patients had either a prior MI or already have heart failure or already underwent revascularization. In CANVAS, this is the trial for canagliflozin, 65.6% of them had an established CVD, while the rest only had multiple risk factors. What do you mean? What do we mean by that? Those who have obesity, hypertension, smokers, retinopathy, etc. In DECLARE, this is the trial for dapagliflozin, which enrolled over 17,160 patients. No? This is a more balanced trial because it included 40% with an established CVD and 60% only with multiple risk factors. And when you look at patients in your clinic, now when you look at your patients in the clinic, majority of them will only include patients here. But when the results, EMPA-REG was the one that was the first trial that came out among the three trials. And when EMPA-REG came out, they were really, really, really excited over the results of the study because the magnitude of the benefit of EMPA-REG was really, really, really very high. No? The magnitude of effect, the absolute risk reduction from developing cardiovascular outcomes was really, really very big. And the magnitude of effect was biggest in the EMPA-REG trial because, compared to the other trials, because majority of the patients here were high risk at the beginning of the study. So since they have very high risk, then the magnitude of the absolute risk reduction would be expectedly higher because they are higher risk, no? But this introduces some form of selection bias. And because of this, no, um, it kind of introduces lack of neutrality because we don't know if when we introduce subjects that only have multiple risk factors and are not very high risk for cardiovascular disease, like among those with established CVD, the magnitude of effect would be more neutral or lower. So essentially, by including patients who are very high risk, no, you tend to overestimate the magnitude of the benefit of the drug. So this is an example of potential deviation from the truth, no? So, and it led to the estimation of the magnitude of the benefit of that particular SGLT2 inhibitor, making the drug look better than they actually are. But actually, the reason for the higher magnitude of benefit is because they only included patients who are very high risk for cardiovascular disease. So when you introduce bias, there could, in observational studies, you can also introduce bias, which can result in incorrect assessment of the association between an exposure and an effect in the target population, in which the statistic estimated has an expectation that does not equal true value. So for example, as an example, I'll show you some examples in the next couple of slides. And because of this can introduce lack of internal validity, meaning the conclusions that you generate from your study cannot be applied in your target population because of the bias that was inadvertently introduced into the study and was not adequately addressed prior to the conduct of the study. So there are two kinds of biases. You have your selection bias and your information bias. So selection bias essentially have different kinds, no? Information bias also have different kinds. So we'll define each of them in the next couple of slides. So in selection bias, an example is when cases and controls, if it's an observational study, like if it's an observational or an experimental study, or those who are exposed and non-exposed, as in an observational study, were selected is such that an apparent association is observed, even if in reality, exposure and disease are not associated. So the truth is, they're not really associated, but when the results of the study came out, there appears to be an apparent association that has been observed because of selection bias. No? This happens when subjects included in the study are not truly representative of the target population. So remember in the first part of our lecture when we discussed eligibility in subject population. So when you do a study, you only get a sample of that entire population. So for example, in the Philippines, if you're looking into people living with diabetes, you cannot get all people living with diabetes. That would be close to impossible or also not practical. So you only get a sample, no? Let's say a bite of the whole cake or a piece of the pie, no? But if you get a sample that is not truly representative of your target population, then you introduce a selection bias. So this is an error introduced when the study population does not include the target population. So what are the causes? It could be due to the study design, bad definition of the eligible population. So remember, eligibility criteria is very, very important. lack of accuracy of the sampling frame, uneven diagnostic procedures in the target population due to implementation. So one example of, let's say, bad definition of eligible population. I did a study with a couple of med students in another medical school, and their proposed study was to determine the effect of pre-admission NMAT score in the passing on the physician licensure exam. Let's say the study was, the intended target population is all the medical students in the Philippines. No? But if the study was done solely, let's say, at the UP College of Medicine, do you think the UP College of Medicine student is representative of all the medical students in the Philippines? Most likely not, because they may not be able to represent all the different kinds of medical students. So you have to include also other medical schools as well. No? So that's an example. Here's another example. So there is a type of selection bias called the healthcare access bias. So for example, in a study investigating mortality from hypertension, the subjects selected were from inpatients admitted for stroke, MI, heart failure, etc. So in this study, this is similar to my example earlier about diabetes. They included admitted patients, no, for stroke, MI, heart failure. And because of this, it tended to overestimate mortality rate because patients admitted are sicker than the general population. So most likely, mortality rates of inpatients are higher. So that's why when you do a study like this, you have to qualify that the study is investigating mortality in hospital mortality from hypertension, and not mortality in general, including the hypertensive people from the community. So this is called their healthcare access bias. Another example of a bad definition of eligible population is there is a study, a classic study, that looked at the mortality rate from tuberculosis comparing vaccinated children and unvaccinated children. So the unvaccinated children are the controls, and the vaccinated children are the cases. So they found that tuberculosis mortality was almost 5 times higher in the controls than in the vaccinated children. So this is vaccination by BCG. So if you can see in this table, the mortality rate from TB among the controls was 3.3% versus only 0.67% in the vaccinated children. And when they analyzed the results of the study, they found that there was an inadvertent introduction of selection bias because they found that vaccinated children had mothers or had parents who were more intelligent and cooperative compared to the controls, the unvaccinated children who had non-cooperative parents. So parents who were more intelligent and cooperative actually took better care of their children, kept more careful precautions. They usually bring the children more regularly to the clinic, no? And very more conscientious in taking care of their children. So their death from TB is apparently lower. Whether it was because of the vaccination or not, we can never probably tell exclusively from this study because there is an introduction of selection bias. It might be from the vaccine, or it may be because the parents took better care of their children. So other sources of uh, kinds of selection bias, you have your attrition bias, or patients who are lost to follow up. If there were, let's say, more patients who were lost to follow up in a certain group or certain exposure, the study results can be affected. Next example is your missing information bias, seen mostly in multivariate analysis, especially if it's a chart review, because chart reviews usually are very, very prone to error because of some missing information. Not all data are recorded, especially if it's a retrospective chart review, because when patients document in the charts, they don't think about a certain study, no? And then when you plug it in a multivariate analysis, let's say, if it's a study on diabetes, only, let's say, 60% of the of the subjects included have an HbA1c result, no? So that is called missing information bias. Missing data affects study outcome. Non-response bias, this is a type of bias that is due to refusals to participate in the study. And these are the individuals concerned are likely to be different from individuals who do participate. So an example of this would be non-respondents must be compared with respondents with regard to key exposure and outcome variables in order to ascertain the relative degree of non-responder bias. So an example would be, let's say you're doing a study on um, the risk of HPV infection among the risk of STDs among high school students. So if you introduce the survey to the high school student, and the high school student knows that he has some sort of a lot of sexual experiences or sexual promiscuity, then he might opt not to participate in the study. Okay, so that's non-response bias. And this is also called healthy volunteer effect. People who are healthy are more likely to participate in a study. So how to overcome selection bias? So one way that was designed to overcome this is, especially in randomized control trial, is what we call randomization. This is very, very crucial when we look at the effectiveness of intervention. No? The critical element of randomization is the unpredictability of the next assignment. You don't know whether you will be assigned in group A versus the intervention group versus the control group. So let's say you're looking at the case fatality of patients with or without arrhythmia. So this is an example. If you do an observational study, let's say you enroll 2,000 patients, no? And then 1,300 of them don't have arrhythmia, while 700 of them have an arrhythmia. Let's say the case fatality rate without arrhythmia is 10% and the case fatality rate without arrhythmia is 50%. If it's an observational study, and they just take let's say the drug on their own, and it's non-randomly assigned, no? You will see that it's possible that only 200, no, out of the 800, 200 out of the 1,000 people in the intervention group will have arrhythmia. And it's also possible that you will be able to enroll 500 people with arrhythmia in the no intervention study. As opposed to an experimental study, the distribution of people with arrhythmia would most likely be equal. No? So 650 without arrhythmia in the intervention group and 650 also in the no intervention group without arrhythmia. So the factor is equally distributed between the two groups, intervention between no intervention, because they are randomized. Remember when you flip a coin, no, when you flip a coin, let's say 20 times. Usually the heads would be 10 and the tails would also be 10. And that's because of due to chance alone, which is equal to or similar to randomization. So here you will see that the incidence of arrhythmia is equal between the intervention and the no intervention group because of randomization. So if you don't do randomization, if you multiply, di ba, remember, the case fatality rate without arrhythmia is 10%. So 800 times 10% is 80. While the case fatality rate here is 200 times 50%, so that's 100. So the total number of deaths would be 180. If you divide it by your N here, so 180 over 1,000, that's your 18% mortality rate. Those who did not receive any intervention, no, the control or the placebo or the control group, no, 500 times 10%, so that's 50. 500 times 50%, that's 250. That's 300%. So 300 divided by 1,000, that's 30%. So it appears from this study that those who received the intervention actually had a lower case fatality rate as opposed to the no intervention group that had a higher case fatality rate. Now, if we look at the randomized clinical trial, no, since the incidence of arrhythmia is equally distributed between the two groups because because of randomization, you will see 650 times 10%, 65, 350 times 50%, 175. So that's 240. So that's 24% case fatality rate in the intervention group or those that receive the drug. And then in the no intervention group, so 650 times 10, 350 times 50, 240. So if you look at the randomized clinical trial, it appears that the risk of death in the intervention group is the same with the group that did not receive the intervention. So was the intervention effective or not? It's not effective because the number of deaths is the same whether you receive the intervention or not. So that's the importance of doing a randomized clinical trial when you're investigating an effectiveness of an intervention. So I hope you got that. Okay? So this is an explanation of that study. Okay? So other ways of overcoming selection bias is allocation concealment. So allocation concealment is hiding the randomization sequence or code from those performing the randomization. It achieves neutrality and ensures that the randomization process is properly applied and not repeated to direct certain participants to certain group in the study. So how do we do allocation concealment? So for example, you are an investigator of a randomized clinical trial looking at the effectiveness of a drug among patients with, let's say, acute cholecystitis. So if I'm the investigator in evaluating the eligibility, let's say I know that the next assignment is for the interventional drug. And I see that the patient is is benign. No? I might be biased to skip it and instead give the placebo drug. Or vice versa, if the patient is very sick and I see that the next allocation is a placebo, I might not give the placebo to the patient, but instead give the interventional drug because I'm thinking the patient is very sick. So if the patient is very sick, I shouldn't be giving the placebo because that might endanger the patient. But since this is a randomized clinical trial, it's important that we know whether the drug truly is the one working or not. So if you do that, that's selection bias. So that's why we conceal the allocation. The one assigning, the one randomizing shouldn't know what is the next treatment assignment so that he will not be biased. Okay, so I hope you got that. So usually what are ways? The traditional way is using a concealed, opaque sealed envelope. So when you get it from the file, it's opaque. You can't look through it, no? Then you assign it to the patient and give the required assigned allocation. But now, that's the old school of doing it. But now we have remote computer allocation. So you call the remote site that does the allocation, and they will tell you what is the treatment assignment of the patient that is being enrolled into the study. Okay? It ensures that the sequence is not altered by clinicians who unknowingly or knowingly tend to disturb it, and therefore you are disrupting the randomization process. So this is what I was talking to you about. You can contact a remote center to obtain a patient treatment assignment, or the old school way, use opaque envelopes containing the allocation sequence that are sealed and numbered, or vehicles or packages containing the medications that are indistinguishable. So the clinician won't be able to inadvertently assign a treatment to favor a particular kind of patient. The next kind of bias is the second kind is your information bias, also called misclassification bias. So this is defined as the quality and extent of information obtained is different for exposed person than for non-exposed person. So the quality and extent of information or data obtained from the patients are different between the two groups. So some examples: self-reporting bias, no? Social desirability bias, recall bias, measurement or error bias, confirmation bias. So we'll focus mostly on the self-reporting bias. So self-reporting bias is when participants who respond to the researcher's question without his or her interference. So this happens when usually in self-administered questionnaires, no? So self-administered surveys or interviews. Sometimes some people have argued that self-reported data is unreliable and are threatened by self-reporting bias but still, these are still valuable in obtaining subjects' perspective, views, and opinions. An example of this is social desirability bias, no? So for example, if it's a sensitive topic, no, such as sexual history, dietary intake, drug use, income, sometimes the subjects tend to self-report something that would make them appear as socially desirable or more approving, no? So self-reporting data can be affected by an external bias caused by social desirability or approval, especially in cases where anonymity and confidentiality cannot be guaranteed at the time of data collection. So, for example, you are looking at the dietary habits of college students. So, if a patient is obese, no, she might try to downplay the amount of calories that she takes in a day, or the number of milk teas that she drinks in a week, no? In order to appear more socially desirable. How to overcome? You need to, it's useful if we use validated self-reporting instrument before implementing it for data collection. Also, by ensuring anonymity, no? So that the answers will not be traced to the respondent. Recall bias is another example of self-reporting bias, where study participants can erroneously provide responses that depend on his or her ability to recall a past event. Usually, this occurs in case control or retrospective cohort study designs where participants are required to evaluate exposure via variables retrospectively using a self-reporting method. An example of this would be looking at prenatal exposure, and the outcome is your congenital defects. No? So for example, you're looking at the risk of congenital defects with the use of topical whitening agents. So people who have mothers who have congenital defects would most likely recall everything that happened during their pregnancy, as opposed to mothers who have normal children. They usually do not remember anymore what their exposure is during the prenatal period. So that's an example of recall bias. Okay, so how do we overcome recall bias? So you can use memory aids or diaries. So usually it's better if you do that kind of study prospectively at the beginning of the pregnancy until the end of the study, and you have a diary for each patient. Interview a subsample of participants prior to initiating the study, or you shorten the duration of the time that the patient needs to recall the event. Let's say you're trying to recall the event 30 years ago, the patients may not be able to recall them anymore because of the latency of the event to the outcome. Other sources of information bias, you have your laboratory tests, systematic errors, random errors. Usually when you do laboratory testing in the patients, clinical examination, diagnostic tests. This is called confirmation bias. You can make multiple and independent checks. So for example, when you're trying to get the blood pressure readings, you take 3 readings and then take an average. Or let's say you're trying to determine weight of a patient, you can have 2 people taking the weight of the patient and then average them into 2. Okay? So this is an example of information bias depending on who is observing. So if it's the left-wing newspaper, their headline will be 1 million civilians killed. But if it's the right-wing newspaper, 1 million bad guys killed. So it depends on where you're coming from. So it is important to accept that bias is a part of investigation. What is important is that quantifying this inevitable bias in its potential sources must be part of well-developed conclusion. Let's say you are unable, it's important at the beginning of the study that you try to overcome the biases. But if you are unable to overcome the biases, you must acknowledge it at the end of your study and make adjustments in your conclusions. No? So for example, you did selection bias. Let's say in our study, in the Philippine College of Physicians National COVID Study, we only included moderate to severe COVID patients, and this overestimates the mortality rate. And this is only the we admitted that the mortality rate is only applicable to hospitalized patients. It does not represent the mortality rate of COVID among all Filipinos because it does not capture asymptomatic or mild cases. So you have to acknowledge that in your study so that it will be a well-developed conclusion. Next, we're going to talk about other concepts that affect relationships of variables with one another in research. So there are actually three: confounding variables, mediating variables, effect modifiers, or variables that create effect modification, interaction, or moderation. But for the purposes, at your level, we will focus only on confounding, not anymore on the other kinds of intervening variables. So thinking about the ways in which variables may be related illuminates bias and confounding. That's why I always encourage my advisees or the trainees that I help with the research paper to create a conceptual framework. The conceptual framework is your roadmap on how your variables are related to one another. So you will be able to identify if you're introducing bias or there are any confounding variables. So what are confounding variables? So this is an example. Diabetes is associated with hypertension. In a study, they found that diabetes is associated with hypertension, meaning people with hypertension have a higher, people with hypertension have a higher risk of diabetes. But does diabetes cause hypertension, or does hypertension cause diabetes? Question mark. Or is it possible that diabetes and hypertension share a common antecedent? So confounding happens in this scenario. No? While an exposure may cause a disease, another way in which exposure and disease may be related is if both variables are caused by factor X, and factor X is called the confounding variable. So for hypertension and diabetes, factor X might be obesity. So remember that obesity is associated with diabetes, obesity is associated with hypertension, or likewise, obesity causes diabetes, obesity causes hypertension. And because of the obesity, people with obesity and hypertension are more likely also have diabetes because of obesity. So essentially, a confounding variable is a variable that is associated both with the exposure variable and the outcome variable. Or obesity or the confounding variable is associated with both the exposure and the disease. Or another way to put it is confounding variable is a variable that is associated with both the dependent and independent variable. So if we had concluded that diabetes caused hypertension, whereas in fact we had no true causal relationship, we would say that the relationship between hypertension and diabetes is confounded by obesity, and obesity would be termed a confounding variable in this relationship. So the truth is diabetes does not cause hypertension, but because of the confounding variable, it appears that diabetes causes hypertension when in fact it is not the truth. So confounders are true causes of disease, whereas biases are artifacts. Okay. So confounders should be identified prior to the conduct of the study. How do we identify confounding? Usually we do this by looking at the literature, analyzing what is already known about the study that you're trying to investigate, and looking at a conceptual framework, how your variables can be related with one another based on your review of related literature. So here is an example. Let's say our hypothesis is that at the beginning of the study, there is an association between exposure, let's say coffee drinking, and a disease or myocardial infarction. When you think about it, it may be true, but when we dig deeper, we can think whether maybe cigarette smoking could be a confounder of this relationship. So how do we identify confounders? No, usually we identify this by looking at the literature again. So step one, is there an association? Heavy coffee drinking is statistically associated with higher rates of MI. So is coffee then a cause of MI? To identify potential confounders. What are the factors associated with myocardial infarction that is also associated with coffee drinking? So could cigarette smoking be a confounder? So is the potential confounder associated with the exposure? So you look at the literature, you can find that heavy coffee drinking is associated with higher rates of smoking. Smoking fulfills one criteria for potential confounding. So next is the potential confounder associated with the disease of interest? So remember, a confounder needs to affect both the exposure and the disease. So look at the literature. Smoking is associated with higher rates of MI. So smoking fulfills the second criteria for potential confounding. So essentially, smoking is associated with heavy coffee drinking, which is the exposure, and smoking is associated with MI, which is the disease. So what happens when we control for cigarette smoking? So is it really smoking that causes the MI, or is it the coffee drinking that really causes the MI? So how can we tell? So we control for confounding by adjustment for cigarette smoking. This eliminates the association of heavy coffee drinking and myocardial infarction. So we can analyze that there is an analysis where you only include non-smokers. Non-smokers, and you analyze whether coffee drinking is associated with MI. And then you already also have a separate analysis where you have smokers and see if coffee is associated with MI. You will see the conclusion will be coffee drinking is not a cause of MI. Okay? It was actually the smoking that causes MI. And it just so happens that coffee drinkers are also, most of the time, smokers as well. Okay? Again, this is a repeat slide. It's important that you identify bias and confounding at the beginning of the study because it's part and parcel of research. But the important step would be, aside from identifying, is to try to overcome it. And if you're unable to overcome it, you identify it in your study and try to make adjustments in your conclusions. I think this is the end of my lecture. So please send me a message if you have any questions. I hope that I did not confuse you further. No, it might be confusing. You can make additional readings. I provided a handout for this. Let me know if there's any confusing concept that you would like to clarify. Just send me a message to your LA. Thank you and goodbye.